Hello again. We're going to be looking at chapter 10 today. Chapter 10 is on Islam. So this is again one of our chapters. I think chapters 8, 9, and 10 were kind of long, and the real purpose of the recording, I think, is to try to help with some of that reading and just break down some of the important parts of the chapter. But first, we want to begin today with the author's introductory story. This has been his practice throughout the book. And so first he comes to Malaysia, and then he moves on to Singapore. But he wants to visit a very important national mosque. And so when he gets there, he's disappointed because the mosque is closed for midday prayer, and that's on their worship day, which was about Friday, and then it turns out to last a little bit longer even than that. And then he finds out that only Muslims are allowed, so he decides instead to strike up a conversation with a woman, and she is a follower of Islam, but she talks about how she enjoys it, and she really mentions about how Islam affects women, and she's grateful for what it provides. And she talks about true Islam and then cultural Islam. But it sounds like they, as most of the conversations in the book with the author, had a good, pleasant conversation and just learning more about another religious faith. And so as we begin the slides, first thing we want to talk about is the founder of Islam, and that is Muhammad. So I've got a couple slides here, and so the next several minutes we'll be talking about him. But Muhammad was born in 570, and he died in the year 632. But he was born in Mecca in what is Saudi Arabia today, and much about what is known about him comes from his sermons and revelations, which are in the Muslim holy book called the Quran. The Quran means recitation, to recite. And the hadiths are also recollections or narratives that are provided, and they tell us more about Muhammad because they are what people remember of him by his early followers. So now Islam is in the same region of the world in the Arabian Peninsula as Judaism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism. And of those, we haven't talked about Zoroastrianism, and there's just a little bit of that later in our chapter as well. But, for example, there were other religious practices going on locally there at the time. So Muhammad was around quite a diverse religious background in his lifetime. So most of these, and some of these, they were polytheistic, and they would worship all kinds of spirits, whether they lived in trees or mountains, whether they were tribal gods, or jinn, which is similar to our English word genie. That's interesting there. But these spirits were thought to inhabit the desert in all their many forms and could even enter people. Allah is the supreme God, the God over all, but he was the object of faith that people had in Islam. Now, Allah was the creator and sustainer of life. He was remote from everyday concerns. So I think we have seen something kind of like that before. Now, there were some goddesses that were associated with Allah that were considered his daughters, and there were 3 of them, but they were related to the nature, to the moon, and fertility. So when Muhammad was born, Mecca was already a place where people would come for religious pilgrimage. So that had already been happening. And part of it was because in Mecca there was a black meteorite that had fallen to earth before Muhammad was born, and it was believed to have been sent from heaven. So it was called the Kaaba, and it was this cube, and there were up to about 360 religious images of tribal gods and goddesses that had been placed within the Kaaba. So pilgrims were coming to see this, on a yearly basis. Now, at that time, it was somewhere, I guess, around 30,000 or so that our book estimates per year that could make this trip, and now it is somewhere up to about 2 million. So, when people would come to Mecca for this, there would be a truce, a 4-month truce, made among Arabian tribes in order to allow the pilgrimages. So warfare would stop while this was going on. Now, a little bit more about Muhammad. His grandfather had a prominent role among the Quraysh tribe, and that was the dominant tribe of Mecca. So he may have had some duties and roles to do with the Kaaba. But Muhammad's father died before he was even born, and then his mother died when he was a child. And so that explains why I mentioned his grandfather, and he went to live with him. And then 2 years later after that, his grandfather dies, and then he goes to live with his uncle. So that's kind of a lot of death for a young child to have to deal with. Now, as he grew into adulthood, Muhammad worked as a caravan driver for Khadijah. She was a widow who had inherited a valuable caravan company from her deceased husband, and she had made it was well established and a source of wealth for her. So they began to have contact with one another. He would work for her, and then eventually they got married. So when they were married, she was 40 and he was 25. So she brought to him financial, spiritual, and emotional support. And there were just a lot of good things about Muhammad that really reinforced him as a good person. And that's some of the things that Khadijah saw in him. And when she asked if he wanted to get married, that she talked about. Now, while they were married, they had 6 children, but none of them survived into adulthood to be Muhammad's eventual successor. And after Khadijah died, Muhammad had remarried a number of times. And it's explained that some of these were done for various reasons, and one of them was probably compassion, because at this time when you had women who were married and their husbands were soldiers and they died, they needed someone to take care of them and for financial support and legal protection. So that may have been why he had multiple marriages. So Muhammad, from his caravan travels, now he learned a great deal about religions. He's surrounded by them, and then all the differences that are within and among all these religions that are around him as he's making a living as a caravan trader. So, he noticed, again, like Jews and Christians, they disagreed about the role of Jesus and the nature of God, and how some Jews and some Christians did not use images. He was also exposed to the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism and how it emphasized the moral struggle in human life in which people saw the world being subjected to the forces of good and evil. So Muhammad was a guy who wanted to think and ponder and meditate about what he was seeing and experiencing, and when he would do this, he would go out into the caves and just think and spend time in meditation and pondering. So in one of these caves, when he was doing that, and when he was about 40 years old, he received his first revelation as described in the Quran. So he described it as a bright presence came to him and held a cloth before his eyes that had writing on it. And it commanded him 3 times that he was to recite what was written there. So, this really scared him. He wasn't sure the true source of this, and so he runs out of the cave and then eventually makes back home, and he confides what happened to his wife Khadijah. And she encouraged him to accept what happened as a true communication from God. And so they also had some friends at that time and who were experienced with other religions, and so they did get some input from them. And Muhammad was at least told by one friend that, hey, this is God talking to you, and just be warned that if you do what he says, life's going to be tough for you. So then Muhammad became convinced it wasn't a devil or a demon, but it was really God that was talking to him. And then he was convinced that the bright presence, was Gabriel that had told him to recite. So after more and more revelations, he began to share them with his close family members and his wife. So Ali and Abu Bakr were among some of those first Muslim converts because of being in close proximity to Muhammad and hearing about what was happening to him. So a Muslim is one who submits to God or Allah. Now, when Muhammad was starting to proclaim what he had been revealed, what God had revealed to him, a lot of people did not accept that. He wasn't well received. And many of his messages were about kindness and caring for the poor and the weak. And he insisted that there was only one God to worship. So that was in a society where there were many gods. It was a polytheistic society. So that didn't go over very well at the time with at least some of the people who heard. Now, he also revealed that you couldn't worship other gods, and all the statues and images had to be destroyed as well of all these other gods. And so that was a business decision for some that also made Muhammad's message unpopular. Muhammad said you can't charge interest when you make somebody a loan, and that you needed to have fair contracts. And again, this just upset kind of business during that time of the world, and a lot of people didn't like it for that. Now, in 615, some of Muhammad's followers fled to Ethiopia. Things had gotten so bad. And then Khadijah, she dies in 619, and then after that, his uncle died. And so then it was around that time that Muhammad started to think about his safety, and he considered leaving Mecca. Now, in 620, a very important event happened in Muhammad's life. It was called the Night Journey, or the Night of the Ascent. But he had an experience of being carried to Jerusalem and then ascending into paradise. And on this journey, he encountered angels and great prophets of the past in different levels of heaven before he met God. So Abraham and Jesus and others he met before he finally came into the presence of God. So there is some disagreement of whether this was real or visionary type thing. And there are some artistic traditions representing, again, this night journey or night of the ascent. Now, after this event, it confirmed for Muhammad that he indeed was a prophet and messenger of God. So again, after this, more persecution of Muhammad and his followers increases, and then it gets so bad that they finally leave Mecca in 622. And so this is called the Hijrah, where it's the flight or migration, where, again, Muhammad and his followers leave Mecca, but Muhammad always kind of wants to come back. So this is a central event in Islam. So actually, in the Muslim calendar, this is how it is dated. We had mentioned before in Christianity, a lot of modern calendars date everything by the birth of Jesus. Well, a lot of Muslim calendars date everything from the year of the Hijrah as year 1, or in the year of the Hijrah. Now, one of the other things that happened that Muhammad believed that wasn't popular was they rejected his beliefs because now Muhammad did believe Jesus was a prophet, and there were other faiths that did not. And then he thought that the other scriptures, like the Hebrew scriptures and Christian scriptures, they just were inaccurate. They had some error in them. So these enemies eventually were either banished or executed. Now in Yathrib, the first Islamic place of worship called a mosque was set up. Now Yathrib is now Medina, and Medina is the city of the Prophet. And it is one of the most 3 sacred sites, or cities rather, in Islam. Now, in 623, there was a battle between Mecca and Yathrib, and it resulted in a great victory for the Muslim soldiers. And they're, again, gaining power, and it was a great victory. There were incredible odds that Muhammad and his forces were able to overcome. Now, eventually, Muhammad, this kind of begins the path so that Muhammad can return to Mecca in about 630. So it was about 8 years that he was gone, and then he takes control, and then he starts to institute all these changes that he thinks, again, that he was given by God in his revelation. So destroying all the images in the Kaaba and the marketplace, and then just running by his religious ideals. So he was planning more expeditions and to expand the control of Islam, but he died in 632 in Yathrib. So in his final sermon, he opposed tribal loyalties and he preached the brotherhood of all believers. Muhammad is seen, he viewed himself and followers of Islam see him as the last of a long line of prophets who transmitted God's word to the world. And he did not consider himself to divine, but a messenger. And Muslims today view Muhammad as a man who showed perfection in his life. He is revered as an ideal human being and as a model for all other believers. So that's a little bit about Muhammad and his history there. That's very, I think, interesting to look at as all these faiths are and how they have come about. Now we want to transition now to the essentials of Islam for a few slides here. But Islam literally means surrender or submission to God. And a Muslim is one who submits to God or Allah. That is the Arabic word for God, Allah. So both Islam and Muslim, these two words are related to several words that have peace in them. The Arabic word salam and the Hebrew shalom are also examples of words that kind of relate back to peace. Now this peace is an inner peace that is gained by surrendering to the divine. It is a recognition that one should do what the supreme power says. Now Islam refers also to the community of all believers by suggesting a large family. Remember in Muhammad's last sermon, he called the believers a band of brothers. So the Quran states that all believers are a band of brothers. So in the heart of Islam is the belief in an all-powerful God who created the universe and controls it down to the last little detail. So again, mentioned the other religions of Judaism and Christianity, and they all kind of popped up in the same part of the world over different parts of time. Muslims generally get into a prostrate position when they pray. Followers of Judaism stand, and then Christians may kneel or do something else instead. Now that word Allah, we've already looked at that, but the al in the word Allah means the, and the ilah means God. So altogether, the word just simply means God or the God. So it is related to the el or el from the Hebrew word for God. And it's not God's name, but it just means God. It's just a generic word. Now, Muslims, this is in our Blackboard resources, but there are 99 names that Muslims use to describe God. And some of them, for example, are the merciful, the just, and the compassionate. But these names help to demonstrate that God has characteristics of a personal being. Now, in addition to that, God is perceived as all-knowing, all-seeing, and all-powerful. God is referred to as male in Islam, even though God has no gender. And the muezzin, now when day-to-day life, the muezzin is the person who calls people to prayer several times a day. The muezzin will chant that Allah is great and greater than anything else. And so, again, Allah is seen as an active presence, an active force that's really kind of taken for granted in life by the followers of Islam. Now, Muslims will also, when they talk about things, they will use the phrase, if God wills. Now, Islamic belief goes and says that God has repeatedly spoken through the prophets throughout time, revealing His mind and will. So there's a lot of commonality with the prophets of Islam and Judaism and Christianity. So when you go back to Adam, that you will find that in Islam, or Abraham, Moses, Jesus. They're all considered to be prophets. But now the Islam does not accept the idea of the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. But Muhammad is so important that he's called the seal of the prophets. He is the last of the prophets. And so the is the faithful Muslim would trace his or her ancestry back to Abraham, and not through Isaac, but through Ishmael. That's interesting too. Okay, so now some of the shared beliefs that Islam has with Judaism is a belief in the soul, so this afterlife, a bodily resurrection, a final judgment, which Islam calls the Day of Doom, and an afterlife, a hell for the wicked and a paradise for the good. So they also believe in angels and devils. All right, and we again see that the names are just a little bit different for the prophets because of Arabic. But Abraham is Ibrahim, Moses is Musa, and Jesus is Isa there. But again, because of Arabic. All right, now what's really critical in Islam is the 5 pillars of Islam. And so we want to spend a little bit of time with that. You know, all Muslims accept and practice the 5 pillars because they help to support one's faith. They are very important in helping to maintain one's faith. So these pillars that we're going to talk about, they are all mentioned in the Quran, the Holy Book, the Holy Scriptures, the recitings that again Muhammad received while meditating in the caves many centuries ago. So the first one we want to look at is the Creed, the Shahada, and it is, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. So this sentence cited along with belief is what makes a person a Muslim. So it is so important that, for example, in Islamic cultures, the first sentence that is whispered into the ear of a newborn infant is the Shahada, this creed there that we've mentioned. It is recited in daily prayer, and it's written everywhere in Arabic inside mosques, inside the domes. People will write it in their homes, over the doors, and everywhere in the Muslim world. So it is a very kind of simple statement there, but it gets to the point, and it communicates a central critical belief. The Quran indicates that God is one God. So the idea of a plurality of gods is just simply rejected, and there's no other God but Him. Now, when we look at other creeds, they're often long and complicated, but that's not the case with the Muslim creed. The second pillar of Islam is prayer or salat. And devout Muslims, they are called to pray upon 5 times a day. The 5 days are at dawn, midday, mid-afternoon, sunset, and nighttime. The muezzin calls out from the top of a tower called a minaret. And so now, you know, with today's technology, instead of having a person up there, you could make a recording and then, you know, have it come on whenever you want it. Now, the call to prayer for Muslims begins with Allah Akbar, and that God is great or God is supreme. And it continues with this phrase in Arabic, I witness that there is no God but Allah, and I witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. Hasten to prayer. So in towns with multiple mosques, the mosque that's considered the most prestigious will go first, and then followed by this call to prayer by the others. Now, before one prays, they are expected to purify themselves with water, and they wash their hands, arms, face, neck, and feet. And if you don't have any water, then you can use sand. The believers are supposed to have their face pointed toward Mecca. And if you're in a mosque, this will be indicated by the Qibla with a marker there. Now, Muslims used to face Jerusalem for prayer, but Muhammad later received some revelations that in Yathrib that changed the direction from Jerusalem to Mecca. The Quran says to turn your face toward the holy mosque, wherever you be, turn your faces toward it. So usually when people are gathered together, one person will act as the leader, and then will quote passages from the Quran while they may be prostrating or sitting or something along that nature. Now sometimes a number of sets of prayers or rakas will be used. Friday is the day of public prayer, and then you can pray other days at home. The day of worship used to be Saturday for Islam, but Muhammad again received a revelation, and that making prayer public on Friday was God's will instead. And usually this is done somewhere around midday. Men and women are separated, and then usually besides the prayer there is a sermon, but it's not really a day of rest like we've seen in some of the other religions. But European influence has some impact on that. The third pillar of Islam is charity to the poor, or zakat. And so Muhammad was a man in his day that saw some injustices in society, and he wanted to do something about it. So whether it was inequality, poverty, or injustice, giving to the poor was one of the ways to make society a more just one. And so usually giving a tax of all that one owns that works out to be 2.5% was one of the ways to fight this injustice. Now, Muslims are also expected to perform acts of generosity and charity for the poor in everyday life. In industrialized societies, the poor is taken care of in a little bit different way than non-industrialized countries. The non-industrialized, they rely more upon these voluntary collections for the poor that are taken up through the way been described. The fourth pillar of Islam is fasting during Ramadan, or Psalm. So it means, fasting means abstaining from food for a certain amount of time, and the purpose is to discipline yourself to develop sympathy for the poor and the hungry. And so you give the food away, and while others are consuming what you would have eaten. So it's thought to be good for one's spiritual growth, that really bonds Muslims together during Ramadan. Now, Ramadan is the 9th month in the Muslim calendar, and it's important because it's the month in which Muhammad received his first revelations. And when Muslims engage in this fast, they avoid all food, liquid, tobacco, and sex from dawn until dusk. So sometimes exceptions are made for travelers, pregnant women, and the sick, but then they're expected to make those days of fasting up at a later time. Now, Islam follows the lunar calendar, and that's important because Ramadan would be celebrated at a slightly different time each year. So that means 11 days earlier each year than the year before, because the lunar calendar is 11 days shorter than a solar calendar. All right, so many religions have these periods of abstinence, just like Islam does with Ramadan. So the Jews do it with Yom Kippur, and the Christians have it with Lent. Now, the last one up here, the last, again, pillar of Islam, or on our slide here, is the pilgrimage to Mecca, or the Hajj. And so, again, we've already seen that pilgrimages were common before Mecca, before Muhammad, and they're going to be common, afterwards too. But this fulfills religious requirements, and it allows the experience of new sights if one has never done this before. So it brings together people of different backgrounds, and maybe a sense of unity can help to develop. But Muslims are expected to make this pilgrimage to Mecca at least one time in their life, unless, again, sickness or poverty prevents them from doing that. So the Kaaba, people come to see that too, this black meteorite that's thought to have been a gift from God that connects to the prophets. And the angel Gabriel was said to have helped carry the Kaaba to earth. So again, lots of people come there. It's a very important event, and lots of observances that our book mentions happen in accordance with this too. So I'll mention some of those real quickly, but if you're going to go to Mecca, you're expected to arrive by the 7th day of the month, and then men wear special clothing called the robe of Abraham. Women really don't have anything special to wear, but they can wear white. The robe of Abraham is white too. So the women do not veil their faces when they're participating in the pilgrimage, but supposedly the same white color illustrates that all people are equal before God. So during the pilgrimage, They are expected to refrain from sex, violence, and hunting. We already mentioned warfare is greatly reduced during this time for religious devotion. So there are some other events that happen, but they will walk 7 times counterclockwise around the Kaaba. They may kiss or salute it, but they are reenacting a lot of the events that happened in the life of Abraham and Ishmael that, again, they hold to be important. Now, Ishmael's mother Hagar, when the boy was a youth and dying of thirst, she was desperate for water. And so the well that they found, they were divinely directed to use, is called Zamzam. And so that is actually where pilgrims who are coming will actually take water and drink it from Zamzam. So these sound like very interesting things to do that further strengthen one's faith when you get to do and see all these interesting things. Now on the 10th day, it's the day of sacrifice. So they reenact how Abraham resisted demons who were tempting him to disobey God by throwing stones at these walls. They'll throw 7 small stones at these walls. Now, as the sacrifice is winding down, there will be an animal sacrifice that can be cooked or eaten or given to charity. But then men and women will cut, or men shave their heads, and women, they cut their hair, and then fingernails and toenails are cut. But it signifies a new purified life. And now a lot of images are prohibited in Islam, but some people will have a portrait commission of this important event and then display it when they get back home. Okay, so now we're going to spend some time also talking about branches of Islam. So that's common in a lot of the faiths that we've seen. But before we do that, there's just some additional Islamic religious practice I want to mention. But there are controls and prohibitions that are imposed in Islam, and they increase social order and happiness. And that's really going back to the conversation that our author had with the woman that he met at the beginning. So crime is relatively rare in Islamic societies, and people do feel secure. So the Muslim world wants to regulate sex, but now they do not value celibacy. That is where they would stop. They see celibacy as unnatural and wonder, maybe why Jesus never got married and had children. That's one of their beliefs. There are dietary restrictions for the Muslims. So, for example, they forbid pork and wine. And wine now is a generic word that they would interpret to mean all forms of alcohol. So, be important to remember that when traveling to a different country that, uses Islam on a wide scale. There are prohibited from charging interest on loans. So, some people get around that by charging a commission instead, and then gambling is seen as a waste of time and a waste of money. Circumcision is something that Muslims do, but they do it at age 7 or 8 for boys instead of the 8th day that we saw in Judaism. So a lot of native religions also practice circumcision, and there's a lot of different explanations as for why that they do that. So for girls, they have a little bit different process, but it's a little bit more harmful to girls, and that's one of the things in our chapter that's mentioned that some people find a little oppressive or repressive to girls because of the female circumcision at puberty. It can decrease sexual desire and lead to infection and some other problems, but there's some other reasons why it would be carried out in places that observed it. Now, in terms of marriage in Islamic societies, it is arranged by the parents and formalized by a written contract. And the wedding ceremony, when it takes place, is often held at home. And now the woman has, the bride who's gotten married, has left the protection of her father and is now under the protection of her husband. All right, so now a lot of these, again, are good things, but when you come into contact with other cultures, then that may cause some people to think that they're, missing out on some things, or whether it's oppressive or what have you. When someone dies in an Islamic society, there is a death ritual. So prayers from the Quran are recited for the dying person. They are buried in a plain white shroud, and then the face of the deceased person is turned toward Mecca. And then there's usually no decoration for the headstone or the tombstone, but that again marks the equality of all people in death. Now, our chapter also mentions several rituals and celebrations that have a lot of historical basis on from Islam about the faith pioneers. That's my word there. Even Muhammad festival for Muhammad's birthday occurs on about the third month of the year, around the 12th day, and some extend it to the whole month. But that's also something. Make sure you kind of look over that when you're reading. We've mentioned a little bit about the scripture of Islam called the Quran, and again that means recitation, but it's the origins of the sacred writings and the sermons of Muhammad. So the best way that the Quran is communicated is by being recited. So that helps one to remember that. Now, the Muslims believe that the only fully authoritative version of the Quran is the Arabic version. So when you get it in a different language, it's just not as authoritative as the Arabic one. Now, the Quran is believed to be God's word delivered to Muhammad over a period of about 20 years, so from 610 to 632, and through those revelations that he received. So now after Muhammad died, there was a need to, for example, have a single authorized version, and so Abu Bakr was Muhammad's first successful caliph or successor, and he started this work, and it finished somewhere around 656. Now, in the Quran itself, there's a repetitive quality that makes sense, but it doesn't seem to have carefully constructed arguments that are divided into segments or stories, but it's rather a body of sermons and utterances. So, again, it repeats images and themes in a natural way, but it discusses a lot of topics and a lot of figures that you can also find in Judaism and Christianity. It talks about things like property rights, money, inheritance, marriage, divorce. It talks about events in Muhammad's life. It talks about angels, divine punishment, fasting, pilgrimage, religious beliefs, and regulations. They are divided into chapters or surahs, and these surahs have titles of themselves. So, for example, there's one surah that is titled Elephant, Light, Dawn, Thunder, the Cave, Smoke, the Mountain, the Moon, and the High One. And the order of the surahs does not reflect the order in which they were revealed. The surahs are arranged by length except for the first one. They go from the longest to the shortest. And it seems that they are placed in reversed chronological order. All right, so the shorter ones are thought to be Muhammad's teachings, and the longer ones are thought to be products of his final years. All right, so a little bit more before we get to the branches there is Muhammad. Now, he died with no male heir and did not appoint anyone to succeed him. So this is going to lead into our branches of Islam. But there was confusion over who was going to take over, and this was a problem for Islam. So Abu Bakr was asked by Muhammad to be the principal leader of prayer, and she happened also to be the father of one of the girls who eventually would marry Muhammad and was one of his younger wives. Now, Bakr actually died about 2 years later, and then he was succeeded by Umar, and then he was succeeded by Uthman. So they were assassinated, and then the fourth caliph was Ali, and that was Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law. And so then Ali was assassinated, and his opponents then assumed control of Islam. So these are the first, this is the first and most significant division of Islam. So as our slide mentions, you've got Sunni and Shiite, and then the Shiite are further broken down into a few more categories there. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Shiite and Sunni division. What is it exactly that they are disputing between each other. So about 15% of the population, generally speaking, is Shiite, and then the remaining 85% would be Sunni. So the real point of discussion is who should succeed Muhammad. So now further divisions have widened over what Muslims should believe, what they should practice, and just the general religious approach of Islam itself. Now the argument really is over the leader or the caliphate. And some thought that the leadership should be by a man held of Muhammad's own tribe. And then others saw the leader should be one that had a blood tie to Muhammad's immediate family. They were physically descended from Muhammad's immediate family. Now, Shiite Islam derives their name from Shia, which means faction. So these are the Muslims who followed Ali, the son-in-law and cousin of Muhammad. So most Muslims, they accepted the legitimacy of the first four successors of Muhammad that mentioned just a few moments ago. That's Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. And some early Muslims said that Muhammad assigned Ali to be a successor, but he didn't come around till about the fourth one. Now, Ali had two sons, Hassan and Hussein, but they were poisoned and actually executed in battle. And Hussein remains a major popular figure today that some of their holidays actually revolve around too. He is seen as a martyr. Okay, but Shiites believe that a God-given hereditary power should lead Islam, and that is called the light of Muhammad. And this has been passed to a total of 12 successors or imams. The first imam, of course, there would be Muhammad, but then the last one appeared somewhere around the year 900, and that was Muhammad al-Mahdi, who was the last one. Tradition says, but he didn't die, but entered a hidden realm. So some think he will come back to usher in a new age, which will herald the end of the world. Now, the Shiites, they have some different divisions. That's where the 12ers and the 7ers and the 5s and the others come in, but they basically have some sort of disagreement about some of the imams. So, for example, the 12ers are going to have a problem over actually who was the or how many imams there were, and they would say there's 12 instead. The 7ers disagree about the identity of the 7th imam, and the 5ers disagree about over the 5th imam, and so that's in part how they got their name. All right, so today Iran is the center of Shiite Islam. Now, Sunni Islam, let's take that in kind of a little bit different order on the slide. Sunni is first, but I talked about Shiite Islam first. But Sunnah comes from the word tradition or example. So it refers to the entire body of traditional teachings based on the life and teachings of Muhammad. So it is developed in part as a critique or a response to what Shiite Islam has come about. Now, the Sunnis have accepted the legitimacy of the Orthodox caliphates that were developing a religious, political, legal, and cultural system that really matched what they thought Islam should be. Now, the rulers there would rule in God's name, and you're talking about a society in which there would be no difference in political and religious power. So one of the groups that would basically be along with these lines of thinking is the Wahhabi sect. So there was a journalist not too long ago, I think for the Washington Post, but at any rate, he unfortunately was murdered, but his religious belief was he was a member of the Wahhabi sect, so he was a member of Sunni Islam is really what that was saying. Now, the Wahhabi movement is they're going to be really conservative. They're going to basically try to be as pure as they can to the Islam that existed early on. So that's the Orthodox that we've been talking about again, and a few other of our faiths that we've mentioned. So the Wahhabi sect would say, hey, we don't venerate deceased people. They don't even celebrate the birthday of Muhammad or visit his burial site. But they have a strict kind of interpretation of what the Quran teaches. They just want to be kind of a simple, modest type observance of alcohol. So they would believe in separating males and females in public and no alcohol either. So there are some other movements in our book. I'm just kind of highlighting some of the major ones, and in addition to what we have on the PowerPoint slides. But there's the Deobandi movement, and that one began in India back in 1867. They have some interesting beliefs, and they think education should only be religious and based on the Quran and Hadiths and really nothing else. There's the Salafi group, and that word actually means admiration of the forefathers. And so they're going to really go back to early Islam and try to be as faithful as they can to that. They have a wide-ranging belief in when it comes to political positions, and some of these would justify violence, and then others that, hey, we don't want to get involved in politics at all. All right, and now another branch that I wanted to mention there was Sufism. So that's like the Islamic mystics. We've talked about that in groups of people who think that you experience God or the supreme power in a direct way, direct contact. And so that's really what happens in Sufism. It's a very austere religion, so, just basic necessities type that, and not luxurious living by any means. But it's going to embrace the monk lifestyle. That certainly made an impression on these Muslims. So again, some of the blending of religious beliefs. Sufism is going to reject celibacy too, as Islam does. And maybe part of the way they became called Sufism, besides the mystic orientation, is they just wore a simple robe of common wool, and that was called, wool is suf in Arabic. So that symbolically showed their opposition to luxury and, just living life high and all that. Sufism says, hey, you've got to involve the heart in your religion. You can't just go through the steps, but you've got to really mean what's going on. So some people call Sufism the heart of Islam. All right, but again, the mysticism is very important. It's the highest form of really experience one can have. It really validates one's beliefs here. And their belief system goes back to the 3rd century, but Plotinus was one who believed that there was one supreme God and one source of goodness that was also into the mysticism. But I think some of their beliefs have really come forward and kind of influenced the Sufi branch of Islam. Gnosticism was also a 1st century kind of mystical way that you could learn about religion and God, and so that was there too. And then the Hinduism has some mysticism too. So all of these influences probably had a little bit of impact into the development of Sufism. Now, our book does give us, again, some different contributions and how Sufism developed over time. So those are interesting. There's also an brief article about Zoroastrianism, which was around this time of the world that had some influence on Muhammad and how that developed. We wish we had a different chapter devoted to that, but we don't. I guess this is the closest we're going to get. But a lot of the similarities that we've already seen, you'll see there too. Now, the last slide really talks about the practices and prohibitions of Islam, and we have already mentioned some of those throughout, but here they all are on one screen. I guess makes it a little bit easier. I wanted to comment just a little bit more about the one with the images. The images, again, that's generally something that's prohibited, but there are some exceptions, and one of them is for Muhammad's night journey that we talked about, where he made his way to heaven and talking to the prophets on his way to talk to God. But when it is pictured, Muhammad's face appears as a blank space, recognizing the Muslim prohibition against the images. Now, the second exception is for the Persian miniatures, and these were commissioned by the Persian court, but it shows people like rulers, people in government positions riding on horseback. These are small little things there, and going to see people kind of walking around in kind of like a garden type atmosphere. That's another exception to the images. And then the final exception is like the pilgrims who return from Mecca. They have a picture commissioned. That's maybe a third example of where you might find some images in Islam. Now, there's also a little bit in our book. It's not on the slides, but I just wanted to mention it. But Islamic thought regarding law and philosophy. And so there's a lot of questions that Islam would try to answer in how a follower should live his or her life. So, how should I live my life according to God's will? How can I understand and relate to God? And these have been debated, by the authority figures for many centuries. So al-Bukhari was one who wrote hadiths and numbered around 3,000 and dealing with some of these issues. And there is some dispute over which hadiths are genuine and which are not. But there are some inconsistencies that some would point to. But Islam has a long history of scholarly debate. And again, it has to decide on things that come up in life on what a believer can do and cannot. So when can a wife request a divorce? Can a village without a mosque be taxed and forced to build one? So these are some of the things that Islamic law and philosophy would have to figure out and tell people today maybe what should take place. Now, the Sharia is Islamic law, and it's the entire body of laws that guide the believer. So, nations today have to realize if they're industrialized, how can they follow Islam and then create laws that can be expected to be obeyed. So now traditional Islam does not separate the religious from the secular sphere. So the goal was to live life closer in harmony with the Quran and its traditional teaching. So really that's a society that's theocratic. So it really doesn't, again, see a difference between secular and religious. But the idea is we make everything in accordance to God's rule and obey God in all aspects of life. All right, but maybe somebody who wants a conservative interpretation would say, well, hey, nature doesn't have different sets of laws, and so why should people either? If nature's laws are not operated, then we're going to have, all types of chaos, and the same thing's going to happen with people if we have different types of laws there. Now, the goal of having one religion enforced around the world has rarely been obtained. Now, it has been recognized that Jews and Christians are people of the book, but they're not seen as perfect as Islam. So usually what Islam would do is let those people continue in their faith but pay a special tax for this right. Muhammad did refer to Jews and Christians as people of the book. Modern-day Iran has had a theocratic rule since 1979. It was on a western track of kind of government, and then since the Ayatollahs have been back in power, it's changed more to that theocratic society. All right, so those are a couple other things to consider that are very interesting. Our book also has a brief section, some more about Islamic philosophy and theology, and it mentions some pretty well-known Muslim thinkers, and their Arabic names are a little bit hard to pronounce, but their Latin names are Avicenna and Averroes, respectively. But what they showed was a lot of interest in medicine, natural science, and philosophy, and they showed how some other Western philosophers they thought were making some errors in their thinking. There's a section in our textbook that deals with Islam and the arts, and again, Islam prohibits a lot of figural art, but they have a love for the chanted word, and so one of their great contributions seems to be architecture, and there's a great number of examples that our chapter points to in connection with that to show the Islamic contribution there. So maybe a few last things to consider there is Islam in the modern world and contemporary living. Islam has been a power for around 800 years, and while the Roman Empire was kind of dying out, Islam continued to grow stronger. And what happened that maybe changed the world a little bit was a lot of trade routes were done by land, but then they started being done by ship. And so that kind of took away some of the power that Muslims were in control of, because they were being bypassed through these ship routes instead. So there was more of a, the European traders kind of figured a way around that obstacle. But yet in the 20th century, it seems like a lot of Middle Eastern countries that do follow Islam were in control of a lot of the world's oil supply, and that has been vital for a lot of countries to be able to purchase oil that way. We've already mentioned about the roles of women in Islam, but there's a lot of increased focus on that now today, especially in the modern world. So Islam, traditional Islam at least, is focused on women and their roles in caring for the home and family. So more domestic type setting. But even there were more severe restrictions on women before Muhammad in his time. So some people consider Muhammad to be a great reformer that made things a little bit better and got some freedoms for women that they didn't have before. So, before Muhammad, men could take as many wives as they wanted. They had few rights and couldn't initiate divorce, and very unlikely to own land or money. But now Muhammad changed that to where the Quran forbids infanticide for females. Women can divorce. They can have their own money and property. So some of those prohibitions are still in effect. So women are required to dress modestly during Muhammad's day when he was alive. And, of course, there's with the veiling and the headscarf. That's something that's also taken place in cultural traditions there. All right. Now, in some cultures, women do have some of these prohibitions. They may not be able to go outside their homes without a companion or travel abroad without male permission, and if so, this makes it hard for them to get an education, to have any social contacts or careers, and again, own money and have property. Another issue for contemporary Muslims today would be some of the cultural influences. So through TV programs and films, women are depicted from cultures that do many things that may not have been permitted in Islamic countries. So, and those who tour may need to beware of some of the rules that are observed in these Middle Eastern countries, again, that follow Islam in terms of maybe like alcohol prohibition or something similar. Now, Islam does find it difficult to accept secularism because, again, they are a theocracy in a lot of cases, but their primary goal is to live life that's acceptable unto God. So there are, just many things that the secular world would endorse that would be objectionable to a lot of Islamic societies. All right, and so that may be hard for people who are followers of Islam when they relocate to another country that is more secular. That would be, I would think, quite a shock to actually adjust to. Now, one of the solutions to that is to lighten up some of these prohibitions, and our book describes that, in which one gentleman there, he did that, and it was in a Muslim population. I think this was one part there. No, it was Turkey. That's right. I was going to say Egypt, but it was Turkey. And that's what their ruler did, is he just really lightened up and adopted a lot of European patterns, and that took place for a while, and then a lot of people are questioning whether that should have taken place or not. There are religious police, the Matawa, and they work to ensure that if there are rules that on how you should live, and again reflecting religious belief, that people do observe those. Now, there is quite a bit of section in our book about different countries and how they do this. So Iran is mentioned, Indonesia, Afghanistan is mentioned, and Malaysia. But they're just trying to do like Turkey, to find a balance, and some do, some don't. But that's really kind of what the book is talking about. Muslims and Hindus, sometimes they don't get along very well, and our book has a brief mention of that and some of the battles and that have happened because of some misunderstandings and conflicts there too. There are, besides the divisions we looked at, some new forms of Islam. The Nation of Islam is one, but that is a religious movement of Islam for exclusively for African Americans. So in America, the first centers that were set up for that were in Detroit and Chicago. The founders of that movement were Wali Farad Muhammad, and then he just disappeared in 1934. He was succeeded by Elijah Muhammad. That's when those centers were set up. But it was just a movement to instill virtues of thrift, of saving money, hard work, education, and self-defense, just building up African American people. So the program for young men was called the Fruit of Islam, and there was a Muslim girls training program for girls. And then Malcolm X, he came in later under this, and so we got a brief description of that. And then now today, Louis Farrakhan is attached to the Nation of Islam, but that's a different branch, and it mentions some conservative branches like Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda means the base or foundation in Arabic. That started in the late 1980s by Osama bin Laden. And it talks about property rights, marriage, divorce, crimes, what kind of penalties for crime should take place. And some people, again, want to use this type of Islam as the foundation for society. So when people start talking about Quranic or Sharia law, that's what they want to do. They want to establish that as the laws of the country rather than, whatever constitution they have or whatever other set of laws that may be in place. Okay, so that's one other group that a couple other groups wanted to mention. And so I think that's probably a good start for our video today, just to give you an idea of what's in the chapter. It's a lot of interesting things in all our chapters, but getting kind of close to the end of the book. But take advantage of the resources that are in Blackboard. I've got some notes and chapter outline, along with some videos, maybe to help with the reading and shorten maybe some of that down with some of these really long chapters, and then the activities to help with the vocabulary before, of course, you take your quiz and your exam, which really count a lot. If I can help you, please send me an email or call me. I'll be glad to help any way I can, but I hope you're having a good day, and I'll see you the next time.